Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. Which city, which country? We want to measure just how far this story travels, because what we're about to share isn't just history. It's the tale of a weapon so unassuming that plantation owners never thought twice about it. A walking stick, a shepherd's staff, a length of oak wood carried by field hands and children alike, but in the hands of someone with 6 years to hone her craft. Someone who understood leverage, pressure points, and the exact angle required to shatter a kneecap or collapse a windpipe. That humble stick became the single, most feared instrument in the Mississippi Delta. This is the story of Naomi Freeman. She was 13 when her campaign began, and 19 when it drew to a close. 23 overseers dead, and she was never caught, not even suspected. They called her the Silent Death, the Shadow Striker, the Ghost with the Staff. But her true name was Naomi, and this is how a girl armed with nothing but wood brought terror to the men who terrorized her people. 23 men. That's the number of overseers who met their end in the Mississippi Delta between April 1852 and November 1858. 23 men whose livelihood depended on controlling enslaved people through brutality. 23 men who carried whips, guns, and hounds. 23 men who rode through cotton fields, upholding the plantation system with systematic cruelty. 23 men who beat human beings for moving too slowly, speaking too freely, or simply existing. 23 men killed by a wooden staff. Smooth oak, 6 feet long, carved in fire, hardened, wielded with such exactness that examining physicians found nearly identical wounds on every body. Shattered skulls, crushed throats, broken spines, necks snapped with surgical accuracy. 23 men who lay down in their plantation beds and never rose again, and the one responsible was a girl of just 13 when she began. Trained in secret by her mother, who had learned stick fighting in West Africa before being stolen and sold into bondage. A girl who understood that a staff is far more than a walking aid. It's a weapon capable of delivering devastating force from a distance of 6 feet. She learned that a well-placed strike to the temple requires only 12 pounds of pressure to kill instantly. She practiced for 6 years until she could hit a specific knot on a tree from 15 feet away in total darkness. For 6 years, overseers in the Mississippi Delta died under mysterious circumstances, found in their beds or along lonely night paths. Their bodies bore injuries that suggested an attacker of incredible skill who then vanished without a trace. Plantation owners ramped up security, hired extra guards, launched endless investigations. None of it mattered. The ghost never missed. The Shadow Striker was never seen until now, until we reveal who she truly was and how she learned to kill with such terrible precision. Naomi Freeman was born into slavery in 1839 on the Wickmore Plantation in Bolivar County, Mississippi. 15,000 acres of cotton in the fertile delta, where the soil ran black and rich, and the labor ran from sunup to sundown. Her mother, Ayana, had been taken from what is now Senegal in 1831 at age 16, sold in Charleston, transported to Mississippi, and purchased by Robert Whitmore, who needed more hands for his growing cotton operation. Ayana came from the Wolof people, a culture where women trained with staffs called takus, both for self-defense and ceremonial purposes. She had drilled since childhood in the movements, the strikes, the philosophy of transforming a simple stick into an extension of your body and will. When she arrived at Whitmore Plantation, Ayana kept that knowledge hidden. Showing combat skill would mark her as dangerous, get her sold or killed. But she never let it go. She practiced in secret, using walking sticks and hoe handles, preserving her abilities through thousands of repetitions performed when no one was looking. In 1838, Ayana was forced into a union with Samuel, an enslaved carpenter on the same plantation. Samuel was gentle and kind, and despite the circumstances, Ayanna came to genuinely love him. In March 1839, she gave birth to a daughter they named Naomi. Samuel died of fever when Naomi was just 3, leaving Ayanna to raise the child alone while working the cotton fields 14 hours a day under brutal supervision. Even so, Ayanna noticed something special in Naomi early on. The girl had perfect balance, could cross narrow logs without hesitation, climb trees with ease, possessed a spatial awareness that seemed almost otherworldly. When Naomi turned 5, Ayanna began teaching her the staff in absolute secrecy. They trained late at night in their cabin with broomsticks, or early in the morning before work with hoe handles. Ayanna showed Naomi the fundamental strikes: the overhead blow to the crown of the skull, the horizontal sweep to the knees, the thrust to the solar plexus, the upward strike beneath the chin. She taught her footwork, how to generate power from the legs and hips rather than just the arms, how to stay balanced while delivering maximum force. She taught her targeting, how to identify vulnerable points on the body where even moderate force could disable or kill temples, throat, base of skull, spine, knees, groin. Most crucially, Ayanna taught Naomi the philosophy behind it. The staff is not for showing off or fighting fair. It exists to end threats as swiftly and permanently as possible. You don't engage in combat. You strike once from ambush, and you kill instantly. There is no honor in plantation violence, only survival, and sometimes, if you're fortunate and skilled, revenge. Naomi absorbed these lessons like a sponge. By age 8, she could execute basic strikes with adult-level precision. By 10, she could hit a mark the size of a man's temple from 10 feet away in darkness. Her strikes were so fast the stick blurred. Ayanna watched her daughter's skill grow with a mix of pride and dread. Pride that Naomi had mastered something powerful, and fear of what that power might demand. This is for protecting yourself, Ayanna told her repeatedly. Never for starting fights, never for pride. You use this only when there's no other choice. You understand? If you kill a white man, they'll murder everyone on this plantation. Everyone. Naomi understood. She was 13 years old in 1852. She had never thought about using her staff against a person. Not yet. That thought would come 1 year later, in April 1852, when everything changed. April 7, 1852. Naomi was 13. Her mother Ayanna was 37. They were in the cotton fields when an overseer named William Crawford started beating a man named Jacob for picking too slowly. Jacob was 62. His hands crippled by arthritis, unable to keep pace with the younger workers. Crawford beat him with the handle of his whip until Jacob collapsed unconscious. Then Crawford turned to the other field hands. "Anyone else want to work slow?" he demanded. Naomi Freeman stepped forward. She didn't shout or threaten. She simply said, "Sir, he's an old man. His hands don't work right. Please don't kill him for something he can't help." Crawford stared at her for 5 seconds. Then he said, "You telling me how to do my job, girl?" Ayanna kept her eyes down, her voice respectful. "No, sir. Just asking mercy for an old man who's worked these fields 40 years. Crawford pulled his pistol and shot Naomi Freeman once in the chest, point blank. Ayanna collapsed into the black Mississippi dirt and died while her 13-year-old daughter watched from 20 feet away. Naomi stood frozen, her cotton sack slipping from her hands. She watched her mother's blood soak into the earth, saw Crawford holster his pistol, as if nothing had happened, saw the other enslaved people return to picking cotton because there was nothing else they could do. Because helping meant dying too. Crawford scanned the silent field. "Any other mouthy want to speak up?" he said. No one answered. Crawford walked away. Naomi stood there for maybe 30 seconds longer. Then she turned and walked away from the field, not running, just walking steadily toward the slave quarters. An older woman named Ruth tried to stop her, warned she'd be whipped for leaving work. Naomi walked past without a word. She went to the cabin she'd shared with her mother, the cabin that still smelled of Ayanna, of the herbs she used for medicine, of the pine soap she made from sap. Naomi sat on the dirt floor and picked up her mother's walking staff. The 6-foot oak stick Ayanna had carved and hardened and used to practice when she thought no one was watching. Naomi held that staff and felt the smooth wood beneath her palms, worn smooth by thousands of hours of her mother's grip. Wood that had taught her everything about fighting and killing. She sat there for hours as the sun moved across the sky. She sat there as the field hands returned at sunset. She sat there as darkness fell and the plantation settled into night. And when the sun rose on April 8, 1852, Naomi Freeman was a different person. The girl who had learned to fight for self-defense was gone. In her place stood someone who understood a simple truth: if the system would kill her mother for asking mercy for an old man, then the system needed to die. And since she couldn't kill the system, she would kill the people who enforced it. The overseers, the drivers, the men with whips who made slavery function through daily violence. Those men could be killed, and Naomi Freeman would kill them. She was 13 years old. She had a wooden staff and 6 years of training, and she had nothing left to lose. If she struck immediately, she would be executed publicly as a warning. But if she waited, if she prepared, studied the patterns of overseers across multiple plantations, she could wage a systematic campaign that would look like accidents or mysteries, rather than deliberate murders. So Naomi spent that first year learning. After her mother's death, she was assigned to work in the big house at Whitmore Plantation, cleaning and serving meals, a position that gave her access to information. She listened to conversations between Robert Whitmore and visiting plantation owners. She learned which overseers were considered cruel, even by the standards of other slaveholders. She learned their names, schedules, habits. She learned that overseers often traveled alone between plantations to coordinate slave patrols. She learned that most overseers lived in small houses at the edges of plantation grounds, isolated from other white people. She learned that plantation owners assumed enslaved people were incapable of organized violence and rarely investigated suspicious deaths thoroughly. The first year after Ayanna's death, Naomi did not kill anyone. This wasn't mercy or hesitation. It was strategy. Naomi understood that killing required more than skill with a weapon. It required planning, intelligence gathering, and, most critically, a way to kill without being caught. So Naomi spent those 12 months gathering information and training with an intensity bordering on obsession. Every night after the big house was asleep, usually between midnight and 3 a.m., she would take her mother's staff and slip into the woods behind the slave quarters. She'd found a clearing 200 yards into the forest where sound wouldn't carry back to the plantation. In that clearing, she practiced the killing arts. Her mother had taught her the basic overhead strike, bringing the staff down vertically onto a target's crown with maximum force. Naomi practiced this 10,000 times that first year, until her arms ached and her hands bled, and the motion became as automatic as breathing. She learned that the key to power wasn't arm strength, but full body rotation. Using her legs and hips to generate force, the staff acting as a lever to multiply that force at the point of impact. A properly executed overhead strike could generate over 800 pounds of force at impact, enough to shatter a human skull like porcelain. The horizontal sweep, swinging the staff parallel to the ground to hit knees, ribs, or skulls, required different footwork. Pivoting on the back foot while stepping with the front, maintaining balance while delivering devastating lateral force. Naomi practiced against tree trunks of varying diameters, learning how different targets absorbed impact. A 4-inch sapling would bend under the strike. A 2-foot oak trunk would absorb it with minimal damage. A human leg fell somewhere between. Bone and muscle that would crack under sufficient force at the right angle. The thrust, driving the end of the staff forward like a spear into throat, solar plexus, or groin, was the fastest strike, covering distance in fractions of a second, ideal when an opponent was approaching head-on. Naomi learned to thrust from various stances, standing still, moving backward, even kneeling. She practiced against fence posts and hanging sacks, learning the precise angle needed to penetrate rather than glance off. The upward strike under the chin, lifting the staff from low position to drive the end upward into the vulnerable underside of the jaw or throat, was devastating, but required being very close to the target, within arm's reach. Naomi practiced this less often because getting that close to an overseer meant risking being grabbed or shot. But she mastered it nonetheless because every technique had potential applications she couldn't foresee. Beyond the basics, Naomi taught herself advanced techniques through trial and error. She learned to strike while moving, maintaining accuracy while running or walking. She learned to strike from unconventional positions, lying down, kneeling behind cover, from elevated spots like tree branches. She learned to use her environment, positioning herself so that a missed strike would hit a wall or tree rather than dissipate into empty air, preserving momentum for a follow-up. Most importantly, she learned to strike in complete darkness. She trained on moonless nights when the forest was pitch black, locating targets by sound and spatial memory rather than sight, delivering blows that hit precise points on tree trunks she couldn't see. This skill would prove critical because most of her kills would occur at night when darkness provided cover. By April 1853, 1 year after Ayanna's death, Naomi was ready. She'd identified her first target, William Crawford, the overseer who had murdered her mother. She'd studied his patterns for a year. Crawford lived in a small house 200 yards from the Whitmore big house. He drank heavily every night, usually passing out by 10 p.m. His house had a front door and a back window he left open for ventilation, large enough for a 13-year-old girl to climb through. On April 7, 1853, exactly 1 year after Ayanna's murder, Naomi waited until midnight. The plantation was dark and silent. She took her mother's staff and moved through the shadows to Crawford's house. She listened at the window until she heard snoring, then climbed through with practiced silence, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Crawford was asleep on his back, mouth open, reeking of whiskey. Naomi stood beside the bed, holding her staff horizontal at shoulder height. She looked at Crawford's face, the man who had shot her mother for asking mercy. She felt nothing, no rage, no satisfaction, just cold focus. She raised her staff above her head with both hands and brought it down with all her strength, directly onto Crawford's forehead. The sound was like a watermelon cracking. Crawford's skull fractured. He died instantly without waking. Naomi climbed back out the window and returned to her cabin. She hid the staff under her bed and lay down. She didn't sleep. She waited for dawn. When Crawford's body was discovered the next morning, the initial assumption was natural death, perhaps a stroke. But the doctor who examined the body found the fractured skull and declared it suspicious. Robert Whitmore ordered an investigation. The sheriff questioned all enslaved people about whether anyone had heard or seen anything unusual. Everyone said no. The sheriff examined Crawford's house for signs of robbery or struggle. He found the open window, but assumed Crawford had left it open himself. The case was filed as an unsolved murder, possibly committed by an unknown intruder. Naomi was never suspected, because the idea of a 13-year-old enslaved girl climbing through a window and killing a grown man with a stick seemed impossible. This would be the pattern for the next 5 years. Between April 1853 and November 1858, Naomi Freeman killed 22 more overseers using various methods. Each kill was meticulously planned and executed with surgical precision. The second kill came in September 1853, 5 months after Crawford. The target was James Morrison, an overseer at Henderson Plantation, notorious for raping enslaved women. Morrison lived in a house near the edge of the plantation, a quarter-mile from the nearest neighbor. He walked home alone every night, after checking the slave quarters, always taking the same path through a cotton field. Naomi studied this pattern for 3 weeks. On September 23rd, she positioned herself in the cotton field along Morrison's route. Lying flat between rows of cotton plants, her staff held horizontal at ground level. At 10 p.m., Morrison walked past, carrying a lantern, whistling. Naomi waited until he was 3 steps beyond her position, then swept her staff hard against the back of his knees. Morrison fell forward, his lantern flying. Before he could recover, Naomi delivered a downward strike to the base of his skull. The impact severed his spinal cord. He died instantly, without seeing his attacker. Naomi disappeared into the darkness, leaving Morrison's body in the cotton field, where it was found at dawn. The death was ruled accidental, a fall resulting in fatal head injury. The third kill, December 1853, targeted Robert Hayes, an overseer at Carlisle Plantation. Hayes was paranoid about the mysterious deaths and slept with his door barred and windows locked. But Hayes had a routine every morning at 5 a.m. Before dawn, he would walk to the plantation well to wash his face. The well was in a small building with a roof, but open sides. Naomi waited in the rafters of that building from 4 a.m. until Hayes arrived. When Hayes bent over the well to wash his face, Naomi dropped from the rafters and drove her staff downward into Hayes's spine, between his shoulder blades. The force was so great it cracked 2 vertebrae. Hayes collapsed, paralyzed, unable to move or cry out. Naomi delivered a second strike to his temple to ensure death. She climbed back into the rafters and waited 30 minutes before leaving to confirm no one else was nearby. Hayes's body was found 2 hours later. The death was mysterious, but not obviously murder. The wounds could have been caused by falling from the rafters onto the well's stone edge. The 4th through 10th kills, between 1854 and 1855, followed similar patterns of patient observation followed by precise execution. Kill 4 was Peter Manning, overseer at Westwood Plantation. Ambushed while riding alone at night, struck from a tree branch as he passed underneath. Skull fractured, dead before hitting the ground. Kill 5 was Samuel Brooks, overseer at Riverside Plantation, killed in his sleep like Crawford, throat crushed by horizontal strike, died without waking. Kill 6 was David Walsh, overseer at Morrison Plantation, where Naomi had been born, killed while bathing alone in a creek at dawn, thrust to the base of his skull as he dunked his head underwater, body found hours later when he failed to report for work. Kill 7 was Thomas Reed, overseer at Henderson Plantation, killed in a barn during evening inspection. Horizontal sweep to the back of the knee, fell backward. Head struck stone, dead when found. Kill 8 was John Smith, overseer at Silverbrook Plantation, killed in his sleep. Throat crushed by horizontal strike. Kill 9 was William Johnson, overseer at Westwood Plantation, ambushed while riding alone at night, struck from a tree branch, skull fractured. Kill 10 was Edward Jones, overseer at Riverside Plantation, killed in his sleep, throat crushed by horizontal strike. Each kill refined Naomi's technique. Each taught her something about human vulnerability. How bodies responded to impact, How to kill efficiently without excessive force that might leave evidence or noise. By kill 10, Naomi had reduced her method to pure mathematics. Identify a vulnerable moment, position for the optimal strike angle, execute with precisely calculated force, verify death, disappear. The emotional toll was significant but manageable. Naomi did not enjoy killing. She felt no pleasure watching men die, but she also felt no guilt, because every man she killed had chosen to make his living through violence against enslaved people. They had chosen to be overseers, knowing what that role required. They had beaten, raped, and murdered people who could not defend themselves. Naomi simply ended their ability to continue that violence. She was not judge and jury. Slavery provided no courts for justice. She was an executioner, acting on behalf of her murdered mother and everyone else who suffered under overseer brutality. This moral certainty sustained her through 6 years and 23 kills. The bodies were always found hours or days later with identical injuries: massive skull fractures, crushed windpipes, shattered spines. Doctors were baffled. The injuries suggested someone with extraordinary strength and skill. Plantation owners became paranoid. Some hired bodyguards for their overseers. Some installed locks and bars on windows. Some theorized that a gang of escaped slaves was conducting organized attacks. None of these measures helped, because Naomi was patient enough to wait for any security to relax, small enough to slip through spaces that seemed too narrow for a human, and skilled enough to kill in seconds of absolute silence. By 1856, 3 years into her campaign, Naomi had killed 14 overseers across 5 different plantations in Bolivar County. The psychological impact was enormous. Overseers became harder to hire because the position had turned deadly. Some quit and left Mississippi entirely. Those who remained were constantly afraid, sleeping with loaded guns, traveling in pairs, jumping at shadows. Plantation owners met to discuss the mysterious deaths. Some blamed vengeful spirits or curses. Some blamed abolitionists sending assassins from the north. No one suspected a teenage enslaved girl because the idea seemed absurd. But Naomi's campaign was not without complications. In July 1856, she attempted to kill an overseer named Thomas Blake at Henderson Plantation. She had waited in a barn where Blake did evening inspections. When Blake entered, Naomi struck from behind with a thrust to his spine. But Blake turned at the last second, perhaps sensing movement, and the strike hit his shoulder blade instead. Blake staggered and shouted. Naomi ran. She escaped through a back door and vanished into darkness before Blake could identify her. Blake survived with a shattered shoulder, but could not describe his attacker, except to say it was someone smaller than expected. This near discovery forced Naomi to be even more cautious. For 6 months after the Blake incident, she killed no one, waiting for heightened security to relax. When she resumed in January 1857, she was even more meticulous in her planning. The Blake incident taught Naomi that even perfect preparation could fail if the target moved unpredictably. She began accounting for this by choosing targets with highly predictable routines and positioning herself to strike, even if the target shifted. The internal conflict during these years was crushing. Naomi was not a natural killer. She dreamed about her mother constantly, reliving Ayana's death, hearing the gunshot, seeing the blood. She woke many nights with silent screams trapped in her throat, because making sound would bring questions. She carried the weight of 23 deaths in her mind, faces she had seen in the moment of killing, the wet crack of skulls breaking, the final exhales. Sometimes she wondered if her mother would approve. Ayana had taught her to fight for self-defense, not for revenge. But Ayana was also the woman who had trained a child to kill with surgical precision, who had taught that violence was sometimes the only response to oppression. Naomi believed her mother would understand. The killing was not sadistic pleasure. It was cold mathematics. Every dead overseer was one less enforcer of slavery. Every overseer's death made the position less attractive to potential replacements. Every mysterious murder created fear among those who profited from enslaved labor. Naomi was conducting guerrilla warfare as a teenager, using the only weapon available to her, fighting the only way possible. For someone who was property in the eyes of the law, the moral complexity haunted her but did not stop her. By 1858, Naomi was 19 years old and had killed 23 overseers over 5.5 years. She had transformed from a 13-year-old girl into a ghost that haunted the nightmares of every overseer in Bolivar County. But maintaining this double life was exhausting. During the day, Naomi worked in the Whitmore big house as a servant. Quiet, obedient, unremarkable. At night, she became death incarnate, moving through darkness with her mother's staff to strike at the men who made slavery possible through violence. The final kill came in November 1858. The target was an overseer named Marcus Patterson. Different from the man who killed Ayanna, but with the same first name, a coincidence that felt like fate to Naomi. Marcus Patterson was known as one of the cruelest overseers in the county. A man who beat enslaved people for entertainment, who separated families as punishment, who raped women with impunity. He had recently been hired at a plantation bordering Whitmore's land. Naomi spent 2 months studying Patterson's patterns. He lived alone in a house at the edge of the plantation. He drank every evening until he passed out. He kept his windows locked, but his back door had a faulty latch that could be opened from outside with a thin piece of wood. On November 14, 1858, Naomi waited until 2 a.m. She approached Patterson's house in complete darkness, moving by memory and feel. She used a piece of kindling to manipulate the door latch. The door swung open silently. Inside, Patterson was snoring in his bed, drunk and vulnerable. Naomi stood beside him holding her staff. She thought about her mother. She thought about all the people Patterson had hurt. She thought about the 22 overseers she had already killed. Then she raised the staff and brought it down onto Patterson's throat with precise force. His windpipe collapsed instantly. He woke for a few seconds, choking, unable to breathe or cry out. His eyes were wide with terror and confusion. He saw a shadow standing over him, but could not identify who it was. He died within 30 seconds. Naomi stood there for a moment, looking at Patterson's body. 23. She had killed 23 overseers in 5.5 years. 23 men who would never beat, rape, or murder anyone again. She felt tired, not regret, just exhaustion. She left through the back door, secured the latch behind her, and walked back to the slave quarters. She hid her mother's staff in its usual place under her bed. She lay down and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5.5 years, she slept without dreaming. The next morning, Patterson's body was discovered. The investigation followed the familiar pattern: mysterious death, identical injuries to previous cases, no evidence, no suspects. But this time, something was different. A new sheriff had been appointed in Bolivar County in October 1858. A man named James Cooper, who was more thorough than his predecessor. Cooper examined all 23 unsolved overseer deaths and noticed patterns. All killed with blunt, force trauma to skull or throat. All killed when alone at night. All killed without witnesses or physical evidence, except the injuries themselves. Cooper theorized that one person was responsible for all 23 murders. But Cooper's investigation led nowhere, because he made the same assumption everyone else made. The killer must be a large, strong man, probably an escaped slave hiding in the woods, using a club or similar weapon. Cooper organized search parties to comb the forests around the plantations where murders had occurred. They found nothing. Because Naomi was not hiding in the woods. She was living in plain sight, working in the Whitmore big house, seemingly harmless. The investigation eventually stalled. Cooper remained convinced the murders were connected, but could not identify a suspect. The case stayed open, but inactive. And Naomi made a decision. She would stop killing, not from fear of being caught, though that was a factor, but because she was exhausted. She had avenged her mother 23 times over. She had created enough fear among overseers to change the system slightly, making the position less attractive, making plantation owners think twice about unchecked brutality. She could not destroy slavery alone with a wooden staff. But she had proven that enslaved people could fight back, that the enforcers of oppression were not invulnerable. That was enough. For the next 6.5 years, from November 1858 to April 1865, when the Civil War ended slavery, Naomi Freeman Davis lived quietly at Whitmore Plantation. She worked as a house servant. She avoided attention. She kept her mother's staff hidden. She was 26 years old when emancipation came. She had killed 23 men between ages 13 and 19, and she was never caught, never suspected, never punished. After emancipation, Naomi left Mississippi. She traveled north to Ohio and settled in Cleveland. She found work as a seamstress. She lived alone in a small apartment. She spoke rarely about her past. In 1873, at age 34, she married a man named William Davis, a carpenter who had been enslaved in Virginia and had escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad in 1857. They had 3 children over the next 10 years. Naomi never told William about the 23 kills. She never told anyone. She carried that knowledge alone, locked behind layers of normalcy and domesticity. But the weight never fully left. She dreamed about her mother, about the moment Ayanna was shot, about the 13-year-old who watched it happen and decided to become a weapon. She dreamed about the faces of the men she had killed, the sound of bones breaking, the stillness after death. These dreams visited her for decades, not every night, but often enough to remind her of what she had done and why. In September 1897, Naomi Freeman Davis, age 58, was diagnosed with consumption. The disease progressed rapidly. By March 1898, she was bedridden, too weak to work, coughing blood into rags. She knew she was dying. Her husband, William, sat beside her bed every day, holding her hand, reading to her, caring for her with a devotion that moved her deeply. On April 6, 1898, 46 years to the day before her mother was shot, Naomi asked William to bring her something from the attic, a long bundle wrapped in old cloth, something she had carried from Mississippi and kept hidden for decades. William retrieved the bundle and unwrapped it in front of Naomi. Inside was a 6-foot oak staff, smooth and dark with age, carved with intricate patterns. "What is this?" William asked. Naomi looked at the staff, her mother's staff, the weapon that had killed 23 men. She told William everything. She told him about Ayanna's murder, about the 13 months of preparation, about the 6 years of systematic killing, about the 23 overseers who died by her hand, about the staff that had been her mother's, and then hers, and had delivered death with surgical precision. William listened without interruption. When Naomi finished, she asked, "Are you horrified? Do you think I'm a monster?" William thought for a long time before answering. Then he said, "I think you were a child who watched your mother be murdered for asking mercy. I think you did what you had to do to survive and to fight back. I think 23 dead overseers is 23 fewer monsters in the world. I think you were braver than most people could ever be. And I think your mother would be proud." Naomi cried for the first time in decades, tears streaming down her face while William held her hand. She died the next morning, April 7, 1898, 6 years to the day after Ayanna Freeman was shot for asking mercy for an old man. Naomi was 58 years old. She had been enslaved for the first 26 years of her life. She had spent 6 of those years as a guerrilla fighter, using a wooden staff to kill the men who enforced slavery through violence. She had spent the next 32 years living free, working, raising children, carrying the weight of 23 deaths in silence. Before she died, Naomi made William promise to burn the staff. "Don't keep it," she said. "Don't pass it down. Let it end with me." William honored that promise. After Naomi's burial, he burned the staff in his fireplace, watching the oak wood that had killed 23 men turn to ash and smoke. But William also did something Naomi had not requested. He wrote down Naomi's confession, every detail she had told him, and sealed it in an envelope with instructions that it should not be opened until after his own death. William Davis died in 1921 at age 83. His children found the sealed envelope among his possessions. They opened it and read Naomi's confession in William's careful handwriting. They were shocked, disturbed, and fascinated. Their mother, the quiet seamstress who made their clothes and taught them to read, had killed 23 men with a stick when she was a teenager. The confession detailed every kill, dates, names of victims, methods used, reasons for targeting each overseer. It was meticulous, horrifying, and undeniable. William's youngest daughter, Sarah, was a teacher and amateur historian. She recognized the historical significance of Naomi's story. In 1923, she published it in a small black newspaper called the Cleveland Advocate in a series of articles titled, "The Girl with the Staff: How One Enslaved Child Fought Back Against Overseers." The articles described Naomi's 6-year campaign in detail. The training from her mother, the 13 months of preparation, the 23 kills, the methods and motivations. White newspapers in Mississippi denounced the articles as fabricated propaganda designed to inflame racial tensions. But the facts were verifiable. 23 overseers had indeed died mysteriously in Bolivar County between 1852 and 1858. The cases had never been solved. Naomi Freeman had been real. Her mother, Ayanna, had been murdered by William Crawford in April 1852, and Naomi had lived in Cleveland from 1865 until her death in 1898. The confession was probably true. Sarah Davis preserved her grandfather William's handwritten document and deposited it with the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland in 1928. That document still exists today in their archives. You can read Naomi's confession yourself, describing how she learned to fight with a staff, how she planned each ambush, how she felt watching overseers die, how she carried the weight of 23 deaths for 46 years. The historical significance of Naomi's story extends beyond the body count. Yes, 23 dead overseers over 6 years is remarkable. Yes, starting at age 13 is extraordinary. Yes, never being caught despite intensive investigations is nearly impossible. But the deeper impact is what Naomi represented. Proof that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting for liberation from outside forces. That resistance could take forms that were strategic and sustained, rather than spontaneous rebellions quickly crushed. That one person with skill and determination could fight back effectively against a system designed to make resistance impossible. Naomi Freeman was not leading armies or conducting large-scale rebellions. She was a teenage girl with a wooden stick, systematically eliminating the men who enforced slavery through daily violence. She was conducting asymmetric warfare decades before that term existed, using mobility, stealth, and precision strikes to neutralize targets who had superior numbers and firepower, but who never expected an attack from a 13-year-old house servant. The psychological impact of her campaign was significant. Even though no one knew who was killing overseers, the fact that overseers were dying mysteriously created fear among those who enforced slavery. That fear made recruitment harder, made existing overseers more cautious, and sent a message to enslaved people that resistance was possible, even if liberation seemed impossible. Whether Naomi's actions were morally justified is a question each person must answer for themselves. She killed 23 men, most of them while they slept or otherwise vulnerable, using overwhelming force from ambush. By any legal standard, these were murders. But Naomi was enslaved. Her mother was murdered for asking mercy, and she had no legal recourse, no political power, no way to resist except through violence. Does that change the moral calculation? She was 13 years old when she started. She watched her mother shot for speaking. She spent 13 months preparing rather than acting impulsively. She targeted only overseers, the specific men who enforced slavery through violence, rather than indiscriminately killing white people. She fought for 6 years with discipline and planning rather than rage and chaos. Does that make her a freedom fighter rather than a murderer? History does not judge. History only records. Naomi Freeman killed 23 overseers between 1852 and 1858 using a 6-foot oak staff. This is documented fact. Whether this was justified resistance or murder, whether it advanced freedom or added to suffering, each person decides for themselves. What is undeniable is that Naomi acted, that she refused to accept her mother's murder passively, that she made a choice to fight back, even when the cost could have been her life, that she succeeded for 6 years against impossible odds, and that she lived 32 more years as a free woman before dying surrounded by family who loved her. Naomi Freeman died April 7, 1898, in Cleveland, Ohio. She was 58 years old. She had been enslaved for 26 years. She had borne no children while enslaved, because she refused to bring children into slavery. She had been educated by her mother in combat that saved her life and enabled her revenge. She used that education to kill 23 men who made slavery possible through violence. She was never caught, convicted, or punished. She married, had 3 children, worked as a seamstress for 30 years, and died in her own bed, holding her husband's hand. Remember Naomi Freeman. Remember that she was 13 years old when she started. Remember that her mother, Ayanna, was shot for asking an overseer to stop beating a 62-year-old man with arthritis. Remember that Naomi spent 13 months preparing before taking her first life, training every night to achieve perfect precision. Remember that she killed 23 men in 6 years and was never caught. Remember that her weapon was a 6-foot oak staff her mother had carved and taught her to use. Remember that she created terror with something plantation owners considered a simple walking stick. Remember that she made the overseer position so dangerous that recruitment became difficult across an entire county. Remember that she fought for 6 years as a teenager with discipline most adults could never sustain. Remember that she lived 32 more years as a free woman, raised children, worked honestly, and died surrounded by family. Remember that the system tried to break her by murdering her mother, and failed. Remember that one person with skill, determination, and absolute commitment can make a difference. Remember that resistance takes many forms. Remember that justice sometimes arrives 6 feet of hardened oak at a time. Remember Naomi Freeman, the ghost with the staff. Born enslaved 1839, died free 1898, age 13 when her campaign began, age 19 when it ended. 23 overseers dead and she was never caught. Before we end, tell us in the comments what you think. Was Naomi Freeman justified? Was she a freedom fighter or a murderer? Could you have done what she did at age 13? Share this story. Let people know that resistance happened in ways textbooks never mention. Let people know that a teenage girl with a wooden stick fought back against slavery and won. Let people know that Naomi Freeman existed, and her mother's death was not in vain. Remember her name. Remember her story. Remember that freedom was not given. It was taken, one strike at a time, by people brave enough to fight when fighting seemed impossible. The story continues. Never forget, never stop fighting, never accept injustice. Naomi Freeman showed us how. 23 strikes. 23 overseers who thought they were safe because they had whips, guns, and the law on their side. 23 men who never saw the staff that killed them. 23 men who learned too late that a trained 13-year-old girl with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than any weapon they could imagine.